All right, so let me remark on a few things that came up in this week's discussion on Plato, Aristotle, and Augustine, because I think we've got some interesting material to work with here. As Marcus argued, and I think correctly, certainly the overwhelming approach to ethics in the ancient times was what we call virtue ethics, and he gave a good description of what that means. Sometimes we divide between theories of the right and theories of the good. And virtue ethics very much falls in the theories of the good category. In other words, what does it mean to be a good person? Theories of the right tend to be theories that have to do with right action, and so they tend to be more descriptive of modern theories such as deontology and consequentialist, various versions of consequentialism. It's not quite so neat a dividing line, but roughly theories of the good tend to be about character and tend to cluster in ancient writings and also in non-Western writings to some extent. So we've got that part of it. Whether Augustine is indeed part of that tradition or not is perhaps arguable. I think an argument can be made for Augustine to be part of that. I think an argument can be made that he's doing something slightly different with that. But we're going to come to Augustine in a moment. I want to start with the Credo, and the reason I asked you to look at the Credo particularly is exactly for the reason that Mark has picked out, I think, which is the latter part of it. The question of, they're rehearsing some arguments over whether Socrates should justly have been condemned, and more to the point, should be getting out of prison via the ministrations of his friends. But towards the end of that piece, we have something that's raising the question of what his place is in the state. I mean, what place, more to the point, what place does ethical action have in the state? Is he under some obligation to behave ethically for the good of the state? And if you've read any of the rest of Plato, the dialogues, Marcus pointed out the Republic, which is a great place to look for this. There's clearly a theory of political governance that is very much a kind of hierarchical and kind of integrated theory. And so in the Republic we have this parallel being run between the proper constitution of the self and the proper constitution of the state. And if there's proper ordering in each of these, then you have the well-lived life, then you have justice. All right, that's the meaning of justice. It's a kind of well-ordered structure. This all comes about in the Republic, of course, because of the discussion of the Ring of Gyges story. That is, what if you had the power to get away with it? In other words, not behave ethically, and there would be no consequences to it. So Gyges has this ring, and he can go off and do whatever he wants. And so he, seduces the king's wife and takes over the kingdom and all that sort of thing. It's unclear as to how exactly he does that with a ring of invisibility, but nevertheless, there it is. And so the question is, is he under any obligation to live ethically if there's no consequences to not living ethically? And Socrates, of course, wants to argue that yes, there is an obligation, and the obligation precisely is that both in the terms of the self and in terms of the state, there's a kind of order that is crucial, that is key. If you lose that order, then you're governed by lower impulses, then you become essentially a dissolute character. Okay, so that's behind what's going on in the Credo, and it really ties together two of our themes. The question of ethics and the question of social philosophy. One might imagine that social philosophy stands on its own. In other words, we have a social world described like Hobbes would want to, such that we live in a contract. The contract is necessitated by the fact that not living in the contract is worse. We live in the state of nature under those conditions, but there's no real ethical imperative to living under that contract. I mean, a contract is just a contract. We make an agreement, we can unmake the agreement, presumably. So that really takes apart the question of ethics and the question of social justice or the social philosophy. That's for Hobbes. That's not Aristotle. That's not Plato. That's not any of these ancients. I mean, for them, they all think that there is a sense that the social world and the ethical world are intrinsically tied together. Okay. Now, the nature of that tie, I think, is going to be of interest to us because as we go on, Certainly as we look at some later figures, we're going to see kind of the other side of the social fabric, if you wish, the coercive side, the side which does not just give us opportunities, but curtails our opportunities, that takes them away, that restricts us, that limits us, all of those sorts of things. And so, the question of what the tie should be, I mean, from Plato's point of view, I think the tie is very clearly that living ethically and living well in a social world are just tied together. I mean, you can't have one without the other. And I think that gets loosened later on in some later thinkers. So I think that's part of the reason I wanted you to look at the Credo. I think it raises some questions about that specific ethics social world tie. It may also raise questions, of course, about the third of our three issues, which is epistemology. Certainly that has been an issue, or that very clearly is an issue overall in Plato. I mean, Plato is very clear that behaving ethically is the result of a dialectical move towards the proper understanding of the form of the good. So there is an intellectual and moral tie very clearly there. Of course, we get a different kind of picture with someone like Aristotle, and the reason I gave you the reading from Aristotle that I did is that it's a very famous reading from the Nicomachean Ethics, and it's a reading in which Aristotle is really ultimately telling us the ways in which the intellect also has virtues. Notice the very deliberate use of the term virtue there, right? I mean, it's not simply about following a kind of deductive path of some sort, moving from premises to conclusions or something like that. I mean, it's not that kind of purely logical sort of thing. For Aristotle, intellect is tied up with the question of virtue as well. It's continuous with other kinds of virtues, although, I mean, we can specify what intellectual virtues are. We certainly can see them, and the reason that they're called virtues is that they are laudable things. They're things we ought to be doing. And so in a certain sense, Aristotle in a different way ties together epistemology and ethics, certainly. Ultimately, he's going to bring in social philosophy on all of this as well, because as soon as you start talking about the intellectual virtues, those virtues get emplaced within a social world. And Marcus did talk very well about phronesis, which he uses quite properly the word prudence, which is the normal translation that we have in English. I tend to want to keep it with the Greek word, and it's not just to be pretentious. I think there's some value in keeping a certain ambiguity on the notion of that particular form of knowledge, phronesis. When we get to see Gadamer, Gadamer talked quite a lot about phronesis, and some people through Gadamer interpret the notion of phronesis as tact. Okay, so what is tact? Well, tact is knowing the right thing to do at the right time. Okay, so tact is not just downplaying, what you, kind of softening what you say to people. It's knowing the right thing at the right time, and in a certain sense, that's what phronesis is too. I mean, phronesis is a kind of rationality that is about making things happen. It's a very different kind of virtue than some of the other Aristotelian intellectual virtues, because it has this kind of rootedness to it. It's very much both about knowledge, but also about action, making things happen. It's therefore related to praxis. Okay, whereas Aristotle also talks about techne, which is the reason that's about making, and that's related to poiesis for him, which we get the word poetics or poetry from. So that's the kind of reasoning that leads us to create, whereas phronesis is the reasoning that leads us to know how to act in the world, know how to get things done, essentially. The easy example is things like, I could ask somebody, do you know how to change a tire? And they could say, oh yeah, I can tell you how to change a tire. Let me write you a thesis on that. Let me write you a paper on that. And of course, what I'm going to want to know is, can you actually show me? Can you actually go out to a car and show me that you can change a tire? Forget about the paper. Phronesis is the kind of knowledge that is a kind of show me knowledge. Aristotle's great example of it is the statesman. And so it's the example of somebody who knows how to get things done within the social world. Note the kind of connection here between epistemology, ethics, and social philosophy now, right? Because if it's the statesman, it's the person who has the experience to know not just what the rules are, but about how you how you get people on your side, how you get the votes for something, how you convince people that something is the right course of action. All of those sorts of subtle things that are within the world of politics are very much what Aristotle has in mind with phronesis. And so for him, there is a different way of, I guess, tying together these areas that we have. Intellect has virtues to it, and those virtues are played out within a kind of social world, a social setting. So, so there's those kinds of things that I want you to notice with these readings as we go by. The other thing, let's go on to talk about Augustine briefly here as well. You know, Augustine is giving us a bit of a different picture because he is, you know, while Marcus is absolutely correct that he is heavily indebted to Plato, and he is arguably almost as heavily indebted to Aristotle, it should be said. Maybe not quite, but there is a fair bit of Aristotle if you look for it within Augustine, I would think. There is also a move that Augustine is making. I mean, he is making a kind of move that, you know, as Marcus said, there is a kind of priority to metaphysics that you certainly see through a lot of the medieval thinkers within the Christian world, and also the Islamic world, it should be said as well. You know, there's a priority for Augustine, and he roots it in what he calls elsewhere the imago Dei, which is the image of God. He writes a whole kind of lengthy discussion of what the actual image of God is within us in a work called On the Trinity, De Trinitate. And in that, he goes through a whole bunch of candidates, if you wish, for what God within us actually looks like. As the title might suggest, he's looking for a trinity. Okay, and so he goes through a whole bunch of different kinds of trinities: the lover, the beloved, and the love between them. You know, a whole bunch of different things like this. And so he ends up with memory, understanding, and will as his true trinity. And what he's doing with this is he's establishing that there is both a connection to what is beyond this world, that is, that's an imprint of God within us, and yet it's not God. There is still a gulf between the creator and the created, which is really fundamental for certainly the Christian tradition. That gets fudged in various ways by various thinkers. Certainly as Gnosticism comes in, it gets fudged and things of that nature. But for Augustine, who is kind of an exemplar of kind of the Christian thinker in all of this, for him, it all starts with this notion that there is an image of God within us, imprinted upon us. And so there's echoes of Plato there, clearly. I mean, there's a memory for Plato of the realm of the forms within us, and so we have to go back and find that. What does it mean about ethics, epistemology, and social philosophy for Augustine? Well, let's start with epistemology. Clearly, Augustine is going to follow Plato very strongly in the notion that what we are doing is not learning but remembering. And Augustine's very clear on this. You know, he speaks to this very, very directly, that we are in the process of remembering what was already there. Okay, and in Plato's case, there's the whole story about going through the underworld and being part of the realm of the forms and coming back and being shoved into these bodies by the demiurge, and thus forgetting, because matter is inimical to the notion of the forms, and so we have to go through the entire process of remembering again our previous acquaintance with the forms. For Augustine, the story is about the imprint of God. That's what has been covered over, if you wish. How's it been covered over? Certainly original sin, certainly materiality to some extent, and Augustine talks quite a lot about the limits and the temptations of materiality, the temptations of the senses, the temptations of all of the different things that could take us away from the true intellectual view of God. There's, by the way, a little bit of Plotinus in all of this as well, because there's certainly a kind of you know, a Plotinian or Neoplatonic return to a sense of who we actually are. So for Augustine, therefore, epistemology is pretty straightforward. Okay, for Augustine, ethics becomes fairly straightforward as well, because it's rooted within that memory. Okay, it's rooted within what is, and therefore the key to ethics is to recover that. Social philosophy, I mean, he famously writes The City of God, you know, huge treatise on again running a parallel between the the city of God and the city of humans, and really recognizing that there exists a kind of tension between these two things. You see these echoed in later forms. I mean, Lutheranism is very Augustinian in this way. It runs with that kind of two worlds sort of notion, and that affects certainly philosophers that are indebted to Lutheranism, including Hegel, including even Marx, actually. Others like this. And so that, there's a trace that we can take back to Augustine in all of this. For Augustine, he is one of the first thinkers to really do a lot of interesting work on the issues of desire and the issues of what's not immediately before us. In other words, again, for Augustine, it's not a kind of direct path to knowing the will of God and then just doing it. Okay, so it's not that kind of epistemology at all. It's not the sort of thing, again, where there is a some sort of scientific or logical method. There's a lot of unlearning that has to happen. There is a lot of misunderstanding that we find ourselves in, and so for Augustine, there is this need to this need to account for our epistemological world and metaphysical, of course, but I want to focus on the epistemological part here, in order that we can have a well-ordered social world and ethical world as well. Okay. Now, Augustine, of course, is going to argue that there's a certain form of conversion that's necessary for all of this. You can't simply develop into this or something like that. And he is a great example of this, of course, because he himself underwent conversion experience. He, was dissolute in his youth, and then he became Manichaean, and then he became Christian. And each of those was a kind of awakening for him, a kind of conversion sort of experience. That itself is interesting, it should be said. And if you think about it in terms of some contemporary issues that we have, let's think about it in terms of people being unwilling to follow, let's say, scientific evidence for, I don't know, climate change or, some other contemporary issue. We often think, from a scientific point of view, that what we just need is more education on somebody's part. Someone like Augustine is going to want to say, well, if that stuff is really true, what you're really going to need is a kind of conversion experience. I mean, you're going to need somebody to move from a particular world to another world. And that doesn't happen in a linear fashion. So, that offers another kind of way in which these areas could relate to each other. And it's really a different way, ultimately, than I think we see in either Plato or Aristotle, right? Because for Plato, the dialectic is a pretty, if not linear, at least it's a kind of very rational sort of path. There's no conversion as such needed. We could talk about Platonic mysticism and stuff like that, but that's not really the basis for for ethics or anything like that for Plato. Nor is it really for Aristotle. I mean, for Aristotle, the notion of the mean between extremes is important. There's a lot of kind of on-the-ground understanding and interpretation of what's going on. And so you don't have that kind of jump, that Augustine is assuming that we need. And of course he's assuming that we need it in part because we are irretrievably broken. We cannot see for ourselves, and so we need to be fixed. It's not just that we lack understanding, it's that we misunderstand. Okay, and those are two different things. And so so we've got the beginnings of several different kinds of answers here, and I think we're going to see echoes of these answers all the way through the course, but we're going to see, kinds of themes and variations, I suppose you could put it. We're going to find people resisting these sorts of things. I mean, we're going to be looking at, Auguste Comte and Marx and, Heidegger and people like this, and in a certain sense, they're going to want to deepen the figures that we're already looking at. In a certain sense, they're going to want to say, well, actually, there's something that they missed. They just didn't get it. So for me, I think that is kind of the reason I wanted to start you with this stuff here. I'll be interested to see what you do in the discussion, the questions. As you can see, I'm having to put these videos up after Marcus's thing because I can't seem to embed YouTube videos into discussion answers. So so you'll find these there, but see if you can think about the ways in which each of these figures is giving us a kind of answer to how to relate ethics, epistemology, and social philosophy to each other. You know, what comes first? What if you have this in a certain way? What does it imply about that? I mean, these are the sorts of questions that I think are going to get us started. All right. So thanks very much.